Children, today we are going to learn about the second chapter of history, New Kings and Kingdoms. Now, how much are you aware of kings and kingdoms? Though in present time we don't see any real kings and a kingdom, but you must have seen them in movies wearing a crown and sitting on a huge high chair, and you must have seen in Ramayana how King Dashrath ruled Ayodhya, and he had a powerful army and everything. There was law and order in the country. So we'll also learn in this chapter about some new kings and kingdoms that grew or emerged in the 7th and 12th century. Okay, but before we go ahead, we must know about three words which are very important in this lesson. Now, dynasty. What is dynasty? It is a family of rulers who rule over a country for a long period of time, like we have learned about the Mauryan dynasty. Yes, that means after the king dies, his son takes over. Okay, so it's a hereditary rule. What is a kingdom? Any country which is ruled by a king or a queen, any part of an area which is ruled by a king. An empire, it is a bigger than a kingdom. A kingdom may be a small in size, but empire is huge, covers a big area. So that is called as kingdom. So these three words, please remember as we go ahead in the lesson: dynasty, kingdom and empire. That's what we are going to learn today. Okay. Now, to understand this word better, these words that I have told you about dynasty, kingdom and empire, let's look it through this visual representation. You can see dynasty, as I told you, it is a succession of rulers. That means it is the grandfather, then the son, his grandson. All this is in succession. Once the king dies, then his son, and this again the king's son takes over. So it's a hereditary rule. Now, what can he rule? He can rule a small area, which is called a kingdom, or a bigger area, which is called an empire. Okay, so a bigger area, which consists of more than one or two kingdoms, is called an empire, and kingdom is a smaller area, and dynasty is a rule by succession of kings of the same family. Okay, within the same family, like we have learned about the Mauryan dynasty, the Gupta kings, all these from the same dynasty, they continue to rule one after another. Children, in this video, we are going to learn the following points and topics that are given in your textbook. First is the emergence of new dynasties. Then we look into the administration in the kingdoms. Then we learn about prashastris and land grants, and then we will see warfare which they fought for wealth. Okay, so these are the four topics we are going to cover in this video. Okay, so now we will start with the first topic of the lesson, the emergence of new dynasties. Children, by the 7th century, more and more new dynasties started coming up. Okay, we see a lot of new dynasties. They were all interested in ruling India because of the richness, yes, and which led to battles. Why did they lead to battles? Because they wanted to occupy more and more territories. That led to conquest, and they wanted to build an empire and become a powerful ruler. Okay, so this led to instability and unrest in India. Now we see the emergence of some of the dynasties that we are going to learn in this chapter. They were the Chamanas. You can see they were ruling in Delhi and Ajmer region. Okay, then the Gujar Patiharas, they were ruling in Gujarat and Rajasthan, and they wanted to occupy more and more territories. Then we have the Rashtrakutas. You can see Western Deccan, that is the Karnataka region. Okay, and then we Karnataka and the other places, and Kadamba again we see here down south. Okay, Karnataka and Kerala parts of, and then we have the Palas who are in Bengal. So these are some of the dynasties that we are going to learn today. As I told you, children, in earlier days we had kings. Okay, there used to be kings who would rule a kingdom or an empire, and these kings used to fight with each other, with the other kingdoms, in order to expand their territories. And to fight a war, what do you need? What does the king need? He needs weapons and he needs money. So where will he get? Who will provide him the money and the gifts? So there were people who were called as Samants. Okay, and who were Samants? They were rich landlords or military chiefs. And these Samants then helped the king by giving military support, by giving them soldiers and weapons, and also giving money as gifts to the king for him to help them to expand his territories. Okay. Now, these Saman system was started by Harshvardhana. You must have read about him in class 6th, okay, about Harshvardhana. And he was a great ruler of Kannauj, okay. He was the one who started the system of Samans. Now, the Samans actually, they worked under the king and they were considered subordinate to the king, okay. And as I told you that they were supposed to provide the king with military support and money, okay, whenever required. They had to pay money and provide him with military support and help him in the expansion of his kingdom. But this system later on did not work well when the rulers were very weak, okay. So when the rulers were weak, these Samans gained more power and wealth because they knew now that the king is weak, and they became more powerful. They acquired more wealth, okay, and they called themselves and gave themselves big titles, like they call themselves as Maha Samans, or they call them as Maha Mandaleshwara. That means a great lord of a region. So we see when the kings were weak, who were totally dependent on these Samans, they gained more power and wealth, and finally by giving themselves high sounding titles like these, and then they wanted to now become free from the kingdom and establish their own kingdom. So they asserted their independence and wanted to break away from their kings. Okay, so this is how we see that the Samans are becoming more powerful. So children, when the Samantas became powerful, they began to assert their independence and wanted to break away from the empire, and they even overthrew their kings and declared themselves as kings. Now we'll take an example of one such Samant who overthrew his king. Now you can see here Rashtrakutas in the Deccan, the Karnataka region. They were first the Samantas of the Chalukya kings who were ruling in Karnataka, and during they were Samantas, so they were under the subordinates of the Chalukya kings. Now in the 8th century, there was a Rashtrakuta chief called Danti Durga. Now because he acquired a lot of money and power, he overthrew the king of Chalukyas and declared this area as under his control, and he became the king, and this came to be called as the Rashtrakutas. And once he did that, he also performed a ritual which was called as Hiranyagarbha, or the golden womb. Now this is a ritual which is being performed by the help of a Brahmin. That person is reborn as a Kshatriya. So in those days, it was mentioned that the Kshatriya was the one who could rule a kingdom. So this is why they performed, and it was a superstition that they performed this kind of a ritual called Hiranyagarbha, and he overthrew the Chalukya king and declared himself as the king, and this area now was under the Rashtrakutas, called as Rashtrakutas. And who was the chief? It was Danti Durga. Children, we see some more examples of Samans who asserted their independence, overthrew the kings, and declared themselves as king. One of them you can see here, Kadamba dynasty. Here you can see he was Kadamba Mayura Sharnam. He overthrew his king and declared himself as the king of, and called this area as Kadamba. This became as Kadamba dynasty. And there was another one, Gurjar, from the Gurjar Pratiharas. You can see in the Rajasthan region, there's a chief called Harish Chandra. He also overthrew his king, and he was a Samant, overthrew his king and declared this area under his rule, which came to be known as Gurjar Pratiharas in Rajasthan. Now both these were actually Brahmins, okay, but they changed their profession. They gave up their Brahmanism and took up arms and declared themselves as the king of those areas. Okay, so we see how Samans had become powerful, and this led to the emergence of new dynasties that we are learning between the 7th and 12th century. Okay, so we'll go ahead with it. Children, moving ahead with the next topic of the chapter, we look into the administration in the kingdoms. So we see a rise of new kingdoms coming up, new kings taking up, who were earlier Samans, who were subordinates to the king. They overthrew the king and started establishing their own kingdom. So the one of the most important ones that we must know is the Rashtrakutas here, the Gurjar Pratiharas. They were all Samans, okay. And the one more important dynasty that came up were the Palas in Bengal, and the leader was Dharmapala. So these three are the most important ones that you must remember: the Palas in Bengal, the Gujar Pratiharas in Gujarat and Rajasthan, and the Karnataka region we have the Rashtrakutas. Okay. So these are the three important dynasties. Now children, when these Samans overthrew their kings, they declared themselves as kings and they gave themselves big titles, high sounding titles, just to show how powerful and wealthy they were. So what were the titles they gave them to themselves? They called themselves Maharaja, the king, the great king, Maharaja Adhiraj, overlord of kings, okay, and they also called them as Tribhuvana Chakravartin. That means the lord of three worlds. Which are the three worlds that we have in Hindi? Patal Lok, Dharti Lok, and Swarg Lok. So he is the king of all the three worlds. Okay, so they gave themselves high sounding titles. Now children, these new kings who were earlier Samant, in spite of giving themselves high sounding titles, they required the support of many people. Now why does the king require the support? In order to remain as a king and to run the kingdom smoothly and peacefully and be progressive, he requires money and military support. Now, so these kings, although giving themselves high sounding titles, they shared their powers with the Samans. Okay, you can see the Samans who provided them with the military support and money. They also had to take the support of the peasants because they are the ones who are going to give them revenue, the traders and the Brahmins. Okay, so he had to take help of all these four people in order to rule the kingdom. Okay, so these were the Samans who took help from Samantas, peasants, traders and Brahmins. Now children, to run a kingdom, what is required? Money is required. For what is it required? For food, to feed the people of the country, weapons to fight wars, horses for the military, and for other expenditures, day-to-day expenditures. Okay, so this is what the king requires money from somewhere. Okay, as I told you, the king requires money, and where will the money come from? Where will the resources come from? Yes, they will come from the producers. Okay, that is the peasants. The main source of the revenue for the kingdom was from the peasants, the land revenues, or the taxes that the peasants had to pay to the king. That was the main revenue for the king. So it had to depend on the peasants to give him money as land revenue tax. Now children, all that money that the king got from the peasants as land revenue, he used it for his maintaining his court, for his day-to-day expenditure, for construction of forts and temples, and also to fight wars. So when they fought wars, they acquired territories, they got more and more wealth. They could accumulate more and more wealth. So the main source of revenue that the king got was from the peasants. Children, apart from the peasants' land revenue tax, taxes were collected also from cattle keepers, artisans, traders, okay, and they were asked to pay tax in some form or the other, even if it was whether in kind or in money. So whatever way they could pay, they had to pay tax to the king. Okay, so all were made to pay taxes, and these were the main people. So now these rulers collected a lot of tax from the people, and we look into the Chola kingdom. You know, there were about 400 kinds of different kinds of absurd taxes. Sometimes we wondered why they were asking for taxes on this. Now the Cholas, as I told you, collected 400 different kinds of taxes. One of them was Veti, for forced labor. If anyone had used forced labor, he had to pay a tax which was called as Veti. Property tax, if you had a house, big house, you had to pay tax, which is called as Kadamai. Okay, so these were the two. There were many other absurd taxes. Now imagine collecting a tax for using a ladder to climb palm trees. Okay, then for thatching your roof, the taxes were collected, and even if you handed property to your child, you had to pay a tax. So these were some of the absurd taxes collected by these new kings, and then you come to know how insecure they were there, and just to show that they were very powerful, they collected all these kinds of taxes. Now to collect all these taxes, a tax collector was appointed by the king, and he was usually belonged to a wealthy and influential family, and most of the times he was a close relative of the king, and his post was hereditary. That means after his death, his son would take over the collection of taxes. Now moving ahead, we go to the next topic of your lesson, that is Prashastis and land grants. Prashastis were actually long poems which were written in praise of kings. It's a detailed account of what the ruler did during his time when he was ruling the kingdom. So it is a long poem and a detailed account of the rulers. Now these kings wanted somebody to write a poem on them and glorify them. They wanted them to use words like valiant, victorious, powerful, all kinds of fancy words for themselves, so that people would think, yes, they are very, very powerful kings. Okay, so Prashastis are nothing but long poems which were written in praise of the king. Okay, so we'll see now who wrote them and what did the kings do. So as I told you, Prashastis were long poems composed in praise of a king, and the kings would appoint Brahmins, okay, who would write these poems and depict the king as to be a very victorious kings. The kings wanted praises from themselves, and most of the time whatever the Brahmins wrote may not be true. So they were the Brahmins who were helping the king in the administration. They were appointed by the kings, and they were educated people who wrote glorified things and fancy things about the kings and glorified their achievements, so that people would wonder and find out how powerful this king is. So this is what the kings, the new kings, what did. Okay, so these were called as Prashastis. So you must remember that Prashastis are only long poems. They were written by educated Brahmins, and most of the things that they wrote, they were only glorifying the king, and most of it may not be true. It would be exaggerated. Children, one of the example of a Prashasti that we can see here is was a Sanskrit Prashasti which was found in Gwalior, and they have written about this Pratihara king Nagabhatta, and most of the things, which is not true. He has not conquered those areas. You can see how many areas he has conquered, but actually he has never been there and conquered. But the Brahmins, they have written, glorified his victorious battles. So this is what they have written, which is not true. Now since the Brahmins wrote good things about the kings, they glorified them, so the kings were very happy with the Brahmins and they wanted to reward them. So how did the kings reward the Brahmins? By giving them land grants. Okay, they gave them all kinds of land grants. They gave them land. Now the kings rewarded the Brahmins because they had written such lovely poems on them, long poems about their achievements, and glorified them. So these kings rewarded the Brahmins by giving them land grants. And whoever received the land grant, it was actually recorded on a copper plate like this. Whichever land grant was given, it was recorded on a copper plate, whoever received this land grant from the king. Now, whichever Brahmin got a land grant from the king, first of all, the details were recorded in this copper plate. You can see the picture of the copper plate here. It was recorded there. so that even the king knows to which Brahmin the land has been given. It was first recorded. Then the entire land was demarcated. Like today, if I have a land, I buy a land, what will I do? I will make a wall around it, so that nobody encroaches my land and it belongs to me. So similarly, the that time walls were not built. It was they planted thorny bushes all around the boundaries of that land. And once the Brahmin got the land, received the grant from the king, then he could collect taxes, he could build rooms, he could plant trees. Okay, so the Brahmins who wrote these precious trees in praise of the king were finally rewarded by the king by giving them land grants. And what a wonderful land grants that they got. They could do so many things with that land. They could collect taxes, build rooms, and plant trees. Okay, so this is all about Prashastris and land grants. Children, there was another Prashastri written, a long Sanskrit poem by an author called Kalhana, and he wrote about the history of the kings who ruled over Kashmir in the 12th century. Okay, so as you say, it's written here, a long poem giving a detailed history of the kings who ruled over Kashmir. It was composed by a poet called Kalhana in the 12th century, a long Sanskrit poem. This is another Prashastri written about the kings of Kashmir. Now Kalhana did a detailed research of writing about the history of the rulers of Kashmir. He gathered information from various sources of history, from inscriptions, from documents, from eyewitnesses, and earlier histories that were composed on them. Okay, he wrote a detailed account. So you can see this Kalhana is writing, but as you know, the other Prashastris written by the Brahmins were only in praise of the kings, but he did something different. He criticized the rulers and their policies. Okay, he did not only write good things about them, but he wrote all what was wrong going on, what were their policies, and also criticized them. So this was the difference between other Brahmins who wrote poems and Prashastris only in praise of the kings, which sometimes are not true, but he was the only one who criticized the rulers and their policies. Okay, so this is Kalhana, who wrote the detailed account of the histories of the rulers of Kashmir in the 12th century. Children, we go ahead to the next topic of the lesson, that is warfare for wealth. Children, as I told you, these new kings who were earlier Samantas formed their own dynasty, which were the three important ones. There were Gujar Pratiharas here in Gujarat, Rajasthan. Then we have the Rashtrakutas in Deccan, and in Bengal we have the Palas. These were the three main new kingdoms that were formed, new dynasties that were formed. Now, these three kings tried to control over other areas. They always wanted to expand their territories, and one particular place was Kannauj, which each of them wanted to occupy, because it was felt that if they got control over Kannauj, that means they could now control the entire country, because it was a symbol of prestige for all the three, that they had to occupy Kannauj. So all the three, who were the three? The Gujar Pratiharas, the Rashtrakutas and Palas jointly now fought amongst each other to take control of this place called Kannauj. And because the three were involved in this battle, it was called as the tripartite struggle. Okay, now we look into the importance of Kannauj. Why these three wanted to occupy Kannauj? Now, one of the main reasons for the tripartite struggle was the place Kannauj, and Kannauj was a very strategically located place, North India, on the banks of river Ganga, and it was said that it was a symbol of prestige and power. Whoever occupied Kannauj or was able to conquer Kannauj was actually the most powerful king of that era, and so this led to the tripartite struggle. Now, who were the three involved in the tripartite struggle? It was the Palas, the Gujar Pratiharas and the Rashtrakutas. Now let us look into why Kannauj was so important for all the three dynasties, the Palas, the Gujar Pratiharas and Rashtrakutas. All the three now wanted control over Kannauj. It was very strategically located in the northern part of our country, where and being on the Ganga river, whoever controlled Kannauj would control the entire Gangetic Valley. The entire Ganga Valley would be under his control, and that would mean that the entire trade was under his control. Okay, commercially all the trade, and it had plenty because it was on the river Ganga. There was fertile soil, agriculture was good, plenty of resources, and was very commercially important. Okay, so lots of trade benefits. So anyone who thought could control Kannauj would really, his country would flourish and become very, very prosperous. So all the three fought to get control of Kannauj, and Kannauj was, as it is very important in the previous classes you must have read, that it was the capital city of Harshvardhan. Okay. So Kannauj was best for trade and commerce, and it was also connected close to the Silk Route, China, where silk was imported and exported. And there was also a desire to control this and loot whatever is there, because it was one of the richest place. So all the three were eyeing this. So now let us recap what was the tripartite struggle. It was a struggle between three kingdoms. You can see Gujar Pratiharas, Rashtrakutas and Palas. And why did they struggle? Because they wanted control over the place called Kannauj. Okay, now you can see Kannauj is here. So all the three wanted control. It was a matter of power and prestige. Whoever controlled Kannauj means controlled entire India. So that was the main reason for this tripartite struggle. Now, why was this tripartite struggle fought? Because of the economic importance of Kannauj. It was on in Ganga Valley, and it was said that whoever occupied Kannauj would control the entire Ganga Valley and will have the entire control over the trade. And it was full of resources, fertile soil, lots of agricultural land. So everyone controlled the entire Ganga trade route. And when was it fought? It was fought between the 8th to 9th century, and this continued for 200 years. Okay, this battle between these three dynasties continued for 200 years. Finally, who won? It was Nagabhatta the second from the Gujar Pratihara dynasty. So this was the entire tripartite struggle. Now children, these new rulers and new kings tried to show off their power and wealth by building large, huge temples, and they would pump in a lot of money into these temples. Everything would be gold plated and fine marble. All the valuable things were put into the temples, and so much so that if they attacked somebody else or another place, the first thing that they would do was to attack the temples, because it was a storehouse of wealth. So children, between the 8th to 18th century, there were different provinces in India, and they were ruled by different rulers. Not just that, Indian subcontinent, you can see the entire India, was known for its richness and resources all across the world. So many invaders, the Turks, the Arabs, they all set their eyes on the subcontinent, and they were wanting to invade onto India and loot India. So was it easy to invade India, the subcontinent? No. Let us know the reason why. Now the Indian subcontinent was surrounded on all sides by natural barriers. Like here you see the Himalayas in the north, the natural fortified barriers, the subcontinent in the north. Okay, so nobody could enter from Himalayas. Okay, and even we had three seas surrounding India. So if an invader does not have a navy, he cannot enter India. So you can see it was very difficult for anyone to enter India. So if a foreigner wanted to invade India and didn't have a navy, there was only one option through where he could come to India. Let's look into that. Any foreign invader who wanted to invade India and take away its roots and richness from India, he could not enter because of the natural boundaries. Okay, but the only way that he could enter India was through the northeast mountainous passes. There were passes here in the mountains through which he could enter India. Now, one such ruler, okay, who wanted to invade India and heard about its riches was Mahmud Ghazni, a Turk who ruled Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia and northwest part of the Indian subcontinent. Okay, he had heard about the riches, wanted to invade and loot India. His main intention was to come, attack India, loot its wealth, and take it back to Ghazni, which was in Afghanistan, and beautify his own city. So he was the one who first tried to come into India through the mountainous passes in the northwest part of our country. Now Mahmud Ghazni raided the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent, every year. And what are the things? His main intention was to loot all the wealth from India and take it back to his own country in Afghanistan, a place called Ghazni, and beautify his city with all the loot that he takes from India. But he did not plunder in most of the places. He only plundered temples. Can you see all these temples? Kannauj, Vrindavan, Mathura, Somnath. It is said that he plundered and looted Somnath 17 times. Why did he target only the temples? Yes, because these temples were built by these kings to show off their power and wealth, and they had pumped in all the money into the temples. So these temples were a storehouse of wealth. So he said it is better to just loot the temples, take all the money back, and beautify his own city in Afghanistan called Ghazni. Muhammad Ghazni also wanted to know more about India, so he left back a scholar called Al-Biruni, who wrote about India in Arabic about India in his book, which is called as the Kitabul Hind. So children, let us recap about Mahmud Ghazni. He was a ruler who was ruling in parts of Central Asia and Iran between 997 to 1030 AD. He had heard about the riches and resources of India. He came to India almost every year, and it is said he raided India 17 times, and he mostly targeted the temples because these temples are a storehouse of wealth. Okay, and then he also left back a scholar in India and who wrote a book called Kitabul Hind in Arabic, describing how the people of India were, what are their habits, their clothes, how are their occupation, everything in a detailed account of India is been written by Al-Biruni in a book called Kitabul Hind. Another new king which were becoming very powerful were the Chamanas. They were also called as Chauhans, and were ruling in the Delhi and Ajmer region, here, this area. And they also wanted to expand their territories and take control right from west to east. But they could not do it because they were opposed by the Chalukyas of Gujarat and Gadwalas of UP. One of the most important rulers of the Chamanas or the Chauhans was Prithviraj Chauhan. Okay, he was also called as Prithviraj III, and he ruled from 1168 to 1192. Before the end of the 12th century, there was another Turkish ruler from Afghanistan called Sultan Muhammad Ghori. Now he too had learned about the wealth of India and wanted to invade India. But he was slightly different. He did not want to come to India just to loot and plunder and take away the wealth from India. He was slightly different from Mahmud Ghazni. Okay, So Mahmud Ghazni just came, looted, plundered, took away the wealth and beautified his own city Ghazni in Afghanistan. But Muhammad Ghori had different plans. He wanted to occupy territories and establish an empire in India. Now, Muhammad Ghori, as I told you, wanted to invade India and occupy territories in India, but he had to face stiff opposition from Prithviraj Chauhan, who gave him a tough fight. And in fact, Prithviraj Chauhan defeated him 16 times, and he was unable to conquer India. He had to go back to Gaur. Now Muhammad Ghori would not give up. In fact, he wanted to conquer parts of India, and he was always had a tough competition with Prithviraj Chauhan, who was very powerful. He lost to him 16 times, but yet he did not give up. Again he came back in the year 1192, and both these rulers had a battle in a place called Terai, where Prithviraj Chauhan finally lost the battle. Okay, and then Muhammad Ghori occupied a number of territories in India. So you can see Muhammad Ghori, after defeating Prithviraj Chauhan, occupied entire northwest part of India, and then he went back to Afghanistan by leaving his slave called Qutubuddin Aibar, who was a slave who looked after these territories, and from him onwards we see the starting of the slave dynasty. Now let's look into the details of Prithviraj Chauhan. He was one of the most powerful and courageous king, very valiant ruler. He is also called as Prithviraj III. He ruled from 1168 to 1192, and he defeated the Afghan ruler almost 16 times, but he lost to him in the Battle of Tarai in 1192. But he took his revenge by killing Ghori. Okay, and it is said that he was the last Hindu ruler of Delhi, after which began the slave dynasty. So in my next video, we'll learn about the Chola rule, about its administration, agriculture, irrigation policies, everything about the Cholas.